I want to reflect on today on the dichotomy. Of course, as the title suggests, there is an assumption there that there is a dichotomy. And that's an assumption that I'm making, and throughout this lecture, I'm hoping that I will be able to substantiate that assumption. And again, there's another assumption, that's the ideals and the realities. Again, it is something that I'm personally concerned with, and throughout my research over the years, I try to establish that dichotomy between the ideals and realities, that how Islamic finance, unfortunately, is moving away probably from that ideals. I was lucky throughout my education life and later in my academic life to work with the founding fathers of, as I call it, founding fathers of Islamic economics, the great names like Khurshid Ahmed, Najatullah Siddiqui, Umar Chapra, Naqvi, and hence developed that direct interest at the essence of Islamic finance or Islamic economics, or as I call it, Islamic moral economy. And that moral bit probably is important, that it is missing nowadays when we discuss Islamic finance. I want to go back to some of the issues, why Islamic moral economy is important and how this divergence between ideal and realities has come to the reality. To remind ourselves, it is important in particular, as mentioned, with this financial crisis. In the initial days of financial crisis, everyone immediately jumped on the wagon of ethicality, the greed, and etc. But now, after all these monies of the taxpayers put into the system, no one reminds us any longer the greed, how it is important in explaining the financial crisis. Of course, the church came out as strong in the initial days in relations to the ethical reasons of this failure. And it is important. And this is not only one of the process, a recent publication from Princeton University looking at the 800 years of financial crisis. And this is not only one, and this is not the last, and we will have. And that's the nature of probably coming back from political economic background with my critiques of capitalism. One way or another, this will repeat as well. That's the nature of capitalism. In order to be able to survive, that has to happen so that the political economy nature can change, new elites, new riches can be created in the process. But leaving aside this critical political economic side and going back to the moral issues, I feel that it is terribly important, therefore, to remind ourselves in these days, so that we can, that moral dimension, so that we can prevent Islamic finance, its own development, and running into the same problems as the conventional finance has moved into. Because I feel there's a tendency in Islamic financial circles moving from that authentic understanding, but essentializing efficiency, profitability only, and hence not directly contributing to the lives of ordinary people. And for that particular purpose, for the improvement of the lives of ordinary people, that the Islamic economics in 1960s and 70s in modern times came into existence. And therefore, just to remind us those backgrounds, and then hopefully looking into this convergence that convergence and the divergence that I am talking. Okay. And that gives me why essentialization of the Islamic moral economy beyond the framework of Islamic finance necessary. Because somehow I feel that in the everyday life, in the Islamic finance circles, even sometimes I see scholars making a huge mistake when sometimes they use Islamic economics instead of Islamic finance. And I feel that these are terribly distinct things under the circumstances of the recent developments. Is the way Islamic finance has developed, probably it is terribly difficult to say that it benefits any longer or shares the aspirations of Islamic moral economy. And therefore, I feel that it is important to develop a critical examination of these recent developments in the light of the wisdom of Islamic moral economy, so that we can see how we can probably redevelop Islamic finance to contribute to the life of ordinary people. Because it is one way or another, in current form, Islamic finance is very much commercial banking. I mean, the question can be raised, of course, what is wrong with that? Of course, nothing wrong with that. The only wrong is that Islamic prefix that makes a difference. If the institutions are similar, of course, there is no problem. But what distinguishes Islamic finance from other finances then? And that's the question that we have to pose. And that ethicality, however, in current times, we see, unfortunately, even the scholars in Islamic finance making a huge mistake of equating the prohibition of riba or interest with ethicality. These are two different things. The prohibition of interest is a legal requirement. Is nothing to the particularly ethicality. It does not necessarily have impact on the life of ordinary people on the street. And therefore, it is important to be able to distinguish concepts and looking into, in more critical terms, into the developments have taken place over the years. And therefore, it brings us the issue of compliance, Sharia compliance, hence that brings that discussion, that critical dimension brings us to the Sharia compliance. Because when we look at Sharia compliance, is very much a legalistic and mechanistic term, looking into whether a particular product is halal or not. But what is important for us in order to check whether that moral economy is there, it is the consequences, whether the consequences of those products are working according to the aspirations or what they were intended for. So the consequentialism, unfortunately, is missed in the process by the scholars who have been working on structuring products. And that is something that I, particularly as a person, concerned with. So therefore, the essentialization of Islamic moral economy as a system is crucially important for us in order to be able to locate the larger dimension of Islamic finance. And why? Why it is important, the moral economy? Well, the reality is that probably even in London, although I don't live in London, but living in London in the nights as well, we go around and see the difficulties of people sleeping on the streets. And that's the reality that we have to live with. But looking at and I'm just going to give example from the Western world in terms of why this moral economy nature is important, why the economies have to develop, not the growth. Growth is taking place, no one is denying, and finance, whether conventional finance or Islamic finance, is contributing to the growth of economies in the developing world. But the important thing, how the lives of ordinary people on the street affected, how economies are developed, because development is different than economic growth. And in order to understand that, if you look at the HDI, Human Development Index, developed by United Nations Development Project, unfortunately, looking at the Muslim world, as you can see there, the recent figures just last week released, so therefore I haven't uploaded the 2007 figures entirely yet, but even with 2007 figures doesn't gives us much hope. Of course, the oil-rich countries, in terms of human development, are doing bad, and those of you who are not familiar with Human Development Index, is a composite index looking at the quality of life, how the quality of life is developing. And when we look at, of course, the oil-rich countries, Brunei, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, they are okayish on the ranking. Of course, the first being the Norway in the recent survey again. And the best country in the Muslim world, we can see that Brunei managed to make it 33 in the ranking. But when we look at the large economies in the Muslim world, Saudi Arabia in recent years have done better, but again, ranking 59, considering the huge oil wealth, and still Saudi Arabia 59. The largest economy in the Muslim world, let's look at Turkey. Turkey is even deteriorating, 79 in the ranking. And these are the realities against which we have to work. In other words, how we can manage the development in developing countries, not necessarily in Muslim countries, but in developing countries. There is that reality. So having huge banks, whether conventional or Islamic, if we cannot affect the lives of people, if we cannot change, if we cannot make the change, then there is something wrong somewhere. And in particular, if you have a particular system is called Islamic, and that Islamic connotation, that Islamic has having a special connotation with social justice, development, human-centered development, it indicates that there is something wrong in the process. And therefore, I do remember in 2004, Professor Najatullah Siddiqui, he gave a paper in Jeddah in declaring what went wrong with Islamic finance, or where did we go wrong. And that's an issue that we have to look into. How come Islamic finance haven't moved into the life of ordinary people? Even when we look at, even in the UK, of course, certain Islamic banks are now operating, but again, Islamic finance remains very much an elitist financing, managing large monies of, or big monies of, big corporations or individuals. So that elitism, unfortunately, doesn't help us to respond to the aspirations of Islamic economics or the moral economy. And that is a problem that we have to be concerned with. Because again, as I mentioned before, you can easily say that what is wrong with Islamic finance? It is making money, it is profitable, it is efficient, and etc. And when we look at with the financial crisis, it is resilient, it hasn't affected much. Yes, it is true. But what distinguishes Islamic finance from the conventional finance is that Islamicity. And what that Islamicity requires is an issue that I feel it is missing in the process. Because in the modern conceptualization of Islamic moral economy, and Islamic finance is only a part of that economy, moral economy. It is therefore equating Islamic finance with the moral economy. I feel that it is not right as well. It is just a financing aspect of that moral economy. And therefore, in the modern times, when the conceptualization or the reconceptualization of Islamic moral economy came into existence in the 60s and 70s, that human-centric economic development was considered as a response for the development of these new nation states from Asia to Middle East. And hence, a re-engineering process was started to develop an understanding. Of course, there are plenty of problems in the theoretical dimension of this moral economy. It hasn't developed. And later, of course, with Islamic finance becoming terribly popular, no one is paying any attention in research in Islamic moral economy. But this is an important bit, because if we cannot construct the Islamic moral economy properly, and hence the result that we have, the divergence that has taken place in Islamic finance is a reality of that misconstruct, or probably not entire construction.